Voyage 2 and 3 is more aptly titled My Pilgrimage to Hell and Back. Coming originally from a piece of the world set in the far west of Ireland, we were constantly subjected to the whims of the Atlantic Ocean, which meant that various forms of mist, fog, rain, snow, wind, and storms, with only fleeting glimpses of the sun and very rare occasional bursts of heat. From the house we were raised in as children, you could generally always see in the distance a massive pyramid-shaped mountain called the Reek. Christians called it Croagh Patrick. Whilst people would and did climb the Reek, almost at any given time of the year, there was one particular day of the year traditionally set aside as a pilgrimage day to climb the Reek. This was called Reek Sunday, and would fall on the last Sunday in July. This was a pilgrimage in its truest sense, and for many it was punishment personified. People would travel, and still do, to the mountains on foot and some in bare feet. They would walk around the mountain in bare feet and eventually ascend in bare feet. Wait around on the mountain in bare feet for a mass or religious ceremony, and then descend the mountain in their bare feet. It was also alleged that Patrick himself, a patron saint of Christian Ireland, spent 40 days and nights fasting on the mountain back in the 5th century. Where have we heard this tale before? It is a pretty bleak and sometimes miserable part of the world to be going around in your bare feet and fasting for any length of time. Although it is a spectacularly beautiful place. So if you are going to have a spiritual experience, it is a great place to have one. And once finished, you could go and have a pint in Westport afterwards. When someone motions or uses the term pilgrimage, it reminds me of the Reek and the pilgrims that spent time travelling, fasting and bearing the climb in bare feet. The initial part of Voyage 2 and 3 felt very much like a pilgrimage to hell, just like climbing the Reek. My next voyages were set to take place in a relatively unknown location in Netherlands called Havelte, or, as it was later dubbed by me, my Helvolte. To summarise this pilgrimage, apart from suffering with hunger and a severe head cold, or man flu, as some like to put it, because of the raging wind and storms over most of Europe on that particular day, my flight out of Dublin was delayed for 2 or so hours. When we landed in Schiphol Airport, practically all trains had been cancelled. My Helvolte was about 2+ hours train ride on a normal day, with a taxi ride thereafter to the final destination, so it would take about 3 hours overall. But with no trains running, it would take a lot more time and patience, and all this with a head cold which was not abating. After many hours of waiting about, the coffee, the tobacco, the sniffling, the coughing, the headaches, the hunger, and the crowds of people hustling about, the train slowly began to start running. And finally, a train with a connection to my Helvolte was on. From leaving home that morning to arriving at the venue that night for my next Ayahuasca voyage took over 14 hours. You could probably have run 4 marathons in the same space of time with far less pain and suffering. With no exaggeration, my whole body ached from toe to top, and this was just the beginning of the suffering. Despite the delays, the storms and cancellations, all of the participants managed to somehow turn up. Some, like me, were late, and a few stragglers arrived the next day. The next day, as per usual, was a preparation day, with sharing, dancing, meditation and breathing, etc. The preparation day was tiring and painful. With this day finally done, the next would be all about taking ayahuasca and voyaging, and perhaps even some pain relief for me. Well, that was my hope anyway. The first voyaging day arrived. The usual opening ceremony took place, and finally the ayahuasca was served. This day was the first of 2 voyages for that week, so we had another day and another voyage the following day. The first day didn't begin well. Just after drinking the first cup of ayahuasca, my head began to pulsate with a migraine which persisted for the whole day. Migraines are not something which usually affect me, so this was unusual to say the least. A second cup of ayahuasca an hour later didn't help either. My third was taken to force me to purge, but that didn't work either. For 8 hours solid, my brain was being pummeled, punished, hammered, and beaten into submission, without any relief. It felt like there was a constant stream of electricity flowing through my head, and not a nice type of fuzzy static electricity, but the lightning from a tropical electrical storm type of electricity. This was no fun whatsoever, but there was a point to it. The first voyaging day is best summarized by the feedback given to the ceremony leaders about the first day's voyage a few days after getting home, which went something like this. Dear M, the first day's voyage was a real pain. I have experienced some very physically painful experiences in this lifetime, such as being one hand away from drowning, falling off a roof, and having a scaffold collapse on me. Being in a car when it crashed and turned over. Have shattered a kneecap, broken toes, fingers, and my coccyx at sports. Have dislocated one shoulder several times, including once while having sex. Had my hand burnt by melting plastic in a fire, caught my thumb in a train door and lost the nail, been hit by a bus, tumbled off bikes many times, and even ran a very painful marathon. But this voyage made all these things pale into insignificance. It was like all of the physical pains of this lifetime combined and rolled together in one moment in time. The first voyage was very inwardly and outwardly painful, and being in a group made it even more painful and extremely annoying at times. To be listening to others that to me at the time seemed to be moaning and whinging about minor insignificant things and stuff, whilst willfully distracting the guides and facilitators from paying attention to me, my ego in particular. At times my mind just wanted to shout and roar to everyone, would ye just shut the fuck up? None of ye know what pain is. P.S. Those frigging yoga mats are absolutely terrible. They give me a right pain in the hole. Smiley face and exclamation mark. This is a loose translation of my feedback about the day's first voyage. It was a mighty whinge and moan about everything and everyone, which was my ego expressing itself, and perhaps rightly so. Expression takes all forms and types. The night of this first voyage, my body and mind were utterly exhausted. My body collapsed into bed, sweating through the night in a deep delirium mixed with lucid dreams. But lo and behold, awoke the next day as fresh as a daisy. My cold or man flu had completely dissipated, and my body and mind felt clear, relaxed, and grounded. During my delirium, there were also some very profound revelations which were further clarified on the second day's voyaging with Mother Ayahuasca. The second day's voyage, relief and charity. Mother Ayahuasca was not, on this occasion, to take me from the room we were in, but instead provide me with certain revelations about what was going on for me on a physical and psychological level. The first thing Mother Ayahuasca explained went something like this. The brain is not a storage device, but a conduit and a projection screen. It is the heart chakra that all information, knowledge, and or wisdom come from. Yesterday's migraine was caused because my brain was being used as a conduit for Mother Ayahuasca to download a load of information to my heart. In essence, the brain was being overloaded. Part of this download had been processing in my heart overnight, and thus my brain got some relief, could switch off, so to speak. And today my heart would now feed some of this new stuff to my brain or mind, which would not stress or overload it, and thus no migraine. It was made clear to me that Mother Ayahuasca had taken me back to every single moment in time when my body had been injured physically or my life had been put at risk. A great many of the memories were childhood memories, and this was relevant as there was still a huge degree of trauma stored in my body which had not fully surfaced and had not even been dispelled because of the shock of the events, as described in the feedback to the ceremony leader. The traumas lay hidden, dormant and suppressed. There was a deep sadness hiding within me as my inner child felt uncared for, unprotected and neglected, specifically by my parents. On the occasion of these accidents or incidents, my feeling was that my father had needlessly put me at risk by allowing me to wade too far from the shore, by asking me to light a fire that burned my hand, by getting me to climb a scaffold he had built, by driving the car that had crashed and turned over. Or my father had not prevented his father, my grandfather, from abusing me as a child. And equally, when all of these incidents occurred, it feels like neither my father or mother cared about me or my hurt or injuries to provide me with any protection, care, or comfort. It felt like they didn't want me around, and if a grave accident should befall me, that would be okay with both of them. As a child, it began to harden me to physically pain and emotionally suffer. Because of this hardening over the years, it became easy for me to shrug off or bury physical and emotional pain, not to take care of or look after myself, to be gentle on myself. It was a kind of conditioning which in my early adulthood allowed or taught me to push myself to some stupefying limits, and stupid it was. Consequent to my childhood experiences, as a younger adult, my attitude became indignant towards the welfare of myself, to becoming reckless, damaging my body needlessly, through pushing myself in sports and working physically beyond limits, and then to boot, self-medicating with cigarettes, marijuana and hash. My spell of smoking marijuana and hash lasted a solid 12 years or so, and in the end became my daily evening habit. The core of this stupidity started in my childhood with feelings of abandonment for lack or want of care or protection from abuse. Note, my feeling is, it is not so much the abuse itself that creates the trauma, but the feeling that my parents didn't seem to care enough to want to or actively protect me from being abused or neglected, which in and of itself creates its own psychological trauma. Perhaps this also resonates or is true for others. In other words, my feeling was there was nowhere for me to run to or hide, and no one to confide in, and thus burying or suppressing my childhood fear, anger, anxiety, stress and terror was my way of surviving. Mother Ayahuasca, on the first days of a voyage, got me to face these traumas and pains and to reluctantly embrace my demons. Then on this second day's voyage, she got me to look at myself in the now, to see these childhood events as a lesson or learning, to use them to now embrace myself and take good care of myself physically and emotionally, and to stop compounding the damage. She, Mother Ayahuasca, was prepared to continue to support, guide and assist me unconditionally in this life, and she had always done and would always continue to do this. As for the other people in the room, on this second day's voyage, their silences, their noise, their puking, their screaming, their wailing, their pain, their suffering, their giggles, their laughter, singing and dancing were mine and provided me with a touchstone to resonate and vibrate in bliss. It felt to me as if their emotional expressions were my emotional expressions. We were all interconnected and were one, so to speak. More on this later. My childhood and young adulthood suffering was in great part the making of me. It has provided me with a certain degree of experience and empathy in suffering, and thus a resulting certain inner strength and the ability to allow and have happiness and moments of bliss in my life. A certain karmic energy balancing had taken place. After all, you cannot know bliss unless you have suffered. My true nature had begun to awaken, as my idea of self had begun to dissolve. Towards the end of this second voyage, one of the guides attended me and for some strange reason offered me some sound therapy with a device called a tuning fork. She told me that this particular tuning fork was tuned to work with the heart chakra in particular. She, the guide, banged this tuning fork off her knee and then held the end of it to my chest at the heart chakra location. Obviously, the vibration of the fork went through me, and then suddenly it felt as if my heart was electrified and amplified to the point that its beat could be heard in my head. It felt strong and loud and sounded very familiar. It was such an immediate and strange sensation to hear your own heart beat. It really made the final part of this particular voyage, coming back and getting grounded, really smooth. Key elements / revelations of Voyages 2 and 3. Not all voyages are love and light. Some are sheer mental and emotional and or physical hell. There is usually a point to be made, quite a lot to be learned from such suffering, assuming of course you can make some sense of it afterwards. Migraines in a voyage signify to me there is a big data download happening or coming, and your brain as a conduit is struggling to cope with the amount of stuff that Mother Ayahuasca is downloading or giving you. Your brain is not a storage device, but rather a mini processor of sorts designed to act as a projection screen with the added facilities of a camera, a mic, and a speaker. A very limited communication device. Thus, we, or perhaps just me, should not overload the brain with too much stuff at any one time, but to take stuff in small bits, process those bits in my heart chakra overnight, or longer if needs be, and then act only upon instruction from my heart chakra. That's easier said than done, of course. On this particular theme or revelation, Mother Ayahuasca was not finished with me yet, and would, on another voyage, provide more clarity or insight. Time is not relevant to Mother Ayahuasca. On these voyages, Mother Ayahuasca was able to condense 35 very odd years, maybe more, of stuff about me into just 2 days, suffering on all levels, physical, mental, and or emotional. Creates specific fields of vibrational waves, and Mother Ayahuasca can teach, show, or guide you in how to surf those waves. Suffering, and for that matter, surfing, can awaken a deep empathy in you for others and their suffering. But equally, you can also get so entrenched in your own suffering, you become locked inside yourself. This is your egoic mind kicking into survival mode. Self-preserving. Definitely more on this later. My tolerance for other people's suffering was tested to its limits, as was my assumed unlimited ability to withstand emotional and or physical pain. This was not a test per se, but more a demonstration by Mother Ayahuasca in the futility of withstanding or resisting trauma when there is no need to resist, when it is so much easier to surrender and embrace than perhaps dissipate, dispel, or release it. Let it go, as they say in the popular Disney film Frozen. With suffering comes bliss when all beliefs begin to fall away to be replaced with a knowing or gnosis. When all beliefs begin to fall away to be replaced with a knowing or gnosis. My heart chakra required healing, and at this point Mother Ayahuasca was not yet finished with me. On being back home from voyage 2 and 3, it was not as strange this time being back home as it was with the first voyage. However, there were relatively big changes with me. It felt like a ton of bricks had somehow been lifted from my shoulders, in that many of my childhood traumas seemed to have dissipated. My story had now become a movie which one could objectively observe, view, or look at to say. That was an interesting movie, because one could easily identify or empathize with all the characters that played a part in it. It was only on being back home that it had occurred to me. My mother had been abused as a child, or so she had historically informed me. And it also made sense that if my grandfather had abused me, then he had also abused his own children, including my father, and perhaps my grandparents on both sides had also been abused. Perhaps a linked chain of events, and now that chain and the suffering created had stopped with me. This movie concept or idea is my best effort to explain my sense of detachment from my story and traumas, that is, from an emotional or mental perspective, because there was, and still is, a physical perspective to all of this. My body was no longer in pain and felt totally healed. For approximately 5 or so years prior to my ayahuasca voyages and experiences, my body had begun to exhibit signs of arthritis, and more specifically rheumatoid arthritis, where it had gotten to a point of such tenderness that some days it was difficult to do the smallest of things, like dress myself or make a cup of coffee. My whole body had not yet been affected, and pain was mainly confined to the colder months of the year, and specifically to my knees, wrists, elbows, and sometimes my shoulders and/or neck. It would vary in pain and intensity from time to time, and my body part to body part, and joint to joint. And before you ask, there were no joints involved in the management of pain at that time. My grandmother, on my mother's side, had died as a result of the deterioration caused to her by rheumatoid arthritis, which had begun in her early 40s. Mind you, her relatively rapid deterioration by and large was more likely to have been as a direct result of all the pharmaceutical drugs that she had been prescribed over the years by the doctors, who were supposed to be attending and caring for her. But that is a story for another day, or perhaps another book. My grandmother and the way she had deteriorated and died had been in my head for a very long time, and naturally, in recent years for me, now being in my mid-40s, this was a growing concern. But for me, attending a doctor for advice, or anything else for that matter, was the furthest thing from my mind. Then along comes this miracle medicine plant ayahuasca, and particularly since Voyages 2 and 3 in January 2018, there has been absolutely no pain and no aches and no complaints from me. My ability to dress myself, lift stuff, and make coffee, amongst other things, is now totally pain-free. A day or so after arriving home from the second and third voyages, it occurred to me to do a clear out of my library and review some of my unread books to see if they were worth reading or keeping. After all, the dross books on self-improvement, amongst other things, were removed. All that remained were a few books that had been either only partially read or had been too heavy for me to read when first procured. The 9 or 10 books that remained were on topics such as psychology, philosophy, spirituality, quantum mechanics/physics, and other light bedtime reading materials. These remaining books had been on my shelf for a few years and had been scanned once in a while but never critically read. It took me perhaps a couple of months to get through them entirely, and all that remained of those books was 3. The other 7 or so books were also dross, in that the authors had convinced me they didn't know what they were writing about, were just going through some kind of motion when they wrote them. For some reason, It now seemed easier to read and get what these writers were on about after all these years, and critically grasp when what they were saying was not correct or was untrue, or equally grasp when they were correct and true. For some inexplicable reason, my ability to critically read and grasp more difficult subject matters seems to have been honed or more finely tuned, or perhaps Mother Ayahuasca just wanted to demonstrate to me my ignorance of stuff that was simple to comprehend or know, and or which somehow had been forgotten. The toughest integration for me. You could say, in relation to books, it was a declutter or a clearing out the old for the new. But this decluttering also extended to setting clear boundaries for those who could or would negatively impact upon my life. This initially was the toughest integration to work with, but clearing out books helped me set the stage for what needed to be done. It was easy to set clear boundaries for or with friends, and it was also relatively easy to set boundaries for people who work with me. Some family members did not meet eye to eye on what these experiences have meant or have done for me, or how they have helped me heal, and don't quite get how or why one would subject oneself or ego to such practices. This too is all fine, as they feel at the moment they are just looking out for my well-being, and we have all the time in the world to figure this out. In the interim, my rule of thumb is to keep my distance where possible, but leave my door slightly ajar, a bit like going through the eye of a needle.